My name is Joe Peroni, and this is the Rise Above Project. And today I want to talk about love, I want to talk about romance, I want to talk about the difference between being romantic and being pragmatic. And of course, I want to talk about Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day was this week, and so I've been doing a lot of thinking about it. I have a lot of mixed thoughts about Valentine's Day, so I figured I would make a show about it. Let's start with this. I have a lot of personal training clients, and throughout the years, not just this week, I would ask them questions such as like when they had their kids, right, at a very young age, before, let's say, grade school, before kindergarten even. You're looking at your children. And what is it that you would wish for your children? Would you wish that they ended up with a partner? Because most people end up in relationships, most people end up getting married. Who would you like your child to be married to, or to have a life partner? What kind of partner do you want your child to have? Do you want it to be somebody that they love and that they're in love with, and somebody who loves them? Or do you want it to be somebody who pays the bills, who can afford 600 thread count Egyptian sheets, somebody who can buy the extra pillow, somebody who can get an extra nice car? So do we want to deal with the pragmatics of life, or do we want to deal with actual love? And I have never heard anybody say anything different than, I want my children to experience love. I want them to be in a partnership with somebody who loves them. I hear it over and over. And this is why I have mixed emotions when I think about Valentine's Day. Is because somewhere along the line, with this sentimental, idealistic view of the world, it breaks down. And it's unfortunate. And I tend to be on the side that's more artsy, let's say. I think about things a lot, also as being a therapist. I tend to be on the empathetic side, and I think about this with people. I wonder where that happened or how that happened. And all these people that are in relationships due to pragmatic thoughts, deep down underneath all that, is there a person who's romantic underneath that, who wants to have a different life, that has somehow convinced themselves that it's okay that somebody buys them a sandwich, and that's better than being in a relationship where their eyes sparkle when somebody comes in the door? I also do a lot of writing. And when I do a lot of writing, I also do a lot of reading. And what I notice is, in a lot of romance novels are almost 100% written by women, for women. And they have certain thoughts. And one of the thoughts that has come up that I've seen, because I listen to interviews on these writers as well, they'll say something like, Romeo and Juliet is not a romance story. It's not a romance story because it ends in death, and therefore it's a tragedy. And I thought about that. And here's where the gaslighting continues. Because just because you make up a definition of what romance is doesn't mean it's true. Just because there's thousands of women romance writers who say that and believe it and write stories about, every story is a man sweeping a woman off of her feet, and then they live happily ever after and she's taken care of, and that's the way it ends, that doesn't make it that it's true. I don't care how many people say it, because it's not true. Romance is what you say it is. And what I'll say is that Romeo and Juliet is a great romance story. As is West Side Story, that was modeled after that. I would say The Notebook is also a great romance story. Wuthering Heights, I think that goes back to the 20s or 30s. Great romance story. What do they have in common? The ones I just mentioned. They all end in death. Either one partner or both partners die. That's the reality of it. So who's being more romantic here? They're changing what romance actually is. So that's going to be one of my questions today. Who's more romantic, men or women? as I look at these romance stories as well, I want to know where the truth is, because the romance stories that a lot of these women write, and by the way, I like the way they write really well. They're very descriptive, they tell a good story, I get all that. But it's more of a fantasy. It's not the reality of what romance actually could be or should be. Let's take a look at romanticism as the definition. Now again, people have different definitions. I'll give you one. It means that there's an outlook on relationships in which love is the most important component of that relationship. So I'll ask the question again, who's more romantic, men or women? Well, there is some ways to figure this out. The most well-known romanticism scale is the Romantics Belief Scale. And in that one, men typically outscore women. And they have questions on it such as, do you believe in love at first sight? When we ask that question, 48% of men believe in love at first sight. Women, 28%. And as the questions go on, you'll see the same thing over and over, is that men tend to deal with reality and to tend to deal with, I want to be loved, I want to be cared about, I want somebody to love me unconditionally. And women say, I want somebody to sweep me off my feet, make my life better, and provide and protect for me. Which is, again, interesting because I'm going to gear this part towards many of the young men that I counsel. Is that young men have a lot of difficulty with this because they don't feel like they're being loved for who they are. They're being loved for what they could provide. And if that's true, let's say you're a young man of 25 years old, for example, and you're with a woman that says, I need somebody to provide and protect for me. That's the number, like, that's up at the top of what I need. She can be provided and protected for by a 35-year-old guy, 45, 55, 65, a 105-year-old guy. None of that has anything to do with love and caring and connection and attachment and adoration and admiration. None of that. It has to do with, please protect me, I need another father. And again, society gaslights men into thinking you're not romantic, you're not loving, you're not caring, you're not compassionate, you're not empathetic. And this hurts a lot of men because you go through life thinking maybe there is something wrong with me. Maybe there is something wrong with our gender. And yet, when you actually look at the definition of what romance is, and you look at how many women decide to be in relationships and stay in relationships due to pragmatic reasons, and that's fine, there's nothing wrong with that, but I think it's very hurtful to young men to keep lying to them, saying that their idealistic views of the world is not romantic, because it very well could be. Let's look at how relationships typically go from beginning to end. Let's start off with the beginning. Men believe, or they have a greater importance of having passion in the relationship. Very important to men. Is it important to women? Yes, but by percentage, men want to have more passion in the relationship than a woman does. Men are usually the ones that initiate the first date. This is to be expected. Now, when we're looking at being romantic, by definition, you have to be moving forward. You have to be initiating. You have to be trying to get from point A to point B. In other words, there's a person, I want to connect to them. You're trying to be romantic. If you're trying to just sit back and wait for people to come your way, you're objectifying yourself. Whereas a person who's initiating the relationship and moving forward would be the subject. So the subject is acting upon the object. Now again, we have trouble with this in the year 2024 because a lot of people say, well, you can't objectify somebody. That's true in certain terms. But if you're trying to start a relationship or move a relationship forward, and you're not going to do anything to move it forward other than to wait for somebody to start the relationship for you, by definition, you're making yourself the object. Sorry, but that's what the definition would be. So it doesn't matter if it's a man or a woman, who's ever initiating. So again, you could say a woman is initiating it by trying to look pretty and to look alluring. Right, but that's still being the object. Moving on. Who plans the next dates after the first date, if there is that? Typically the man. Typically the woman wants to see the man be able to take control and to be able to make dates, and that's what the man typically does. Men usually say I love you first, and reports and empirical evidence state that men are the ones who feel greater happiness when they hear I love you for the first time. That is perplexing in a way, because we never hear about that. Why do men have greater happiness when they hear I love you for the first time? Could it be that men typically are not loved for who they are? Typically, it's what can you do for me? What can you do for me now? And what have you done for me lately? And if they hear I love you, they take it as I'm loved, right? So it's like a big deal. Again, not to take this away that women don't like to hear that as well. Of course they do. But women have an extra layer there. When they hear a man say I love you, they have a layer of I don't trust you. And so they're still trying to figure out if they're safe and protected and if this guy is going to be around. So they have that extra barrier, whereas men don't do that. They're more idealistic. So if they hear the words I love you, they just take it at face value. Men typically are the ones who initiate the first kiss. Then they also initiate the first sexual experience. And as the relationship goes on, if it goes on, men initiate sex 60% of the time. 30% of the time, the man and woman initiate equally, and 10% of the time, women are the ones who initiate most of the time. So if we look at these numbers, men initiate sex, even in a relationship, 600% more than a woman does. So again, who's being more romantic? Who's the one moving forward? Who's the one trying to have a relationship? Let's look at something else. Men are the ones who propose marriage 97% of the time. They're the ones who bear the burden of maybe being rejected, and they will do that because they want to be married. And they also take the extra burden of buying the ring. So there's financial component here, and there's an emotional component here. Women propose 3% of the time. So if it's your goal to get married and you're not taking an active role in that, again, who's more romantic here? It's usually the guy that has to set up the time, the place, how to do it, the right ring, the right dinner, whatever it might be. There is an area in relationships where women far exceed men. And this is ending the relationship. Women end relationships or marriages somewhere between 60 to 80% of the time. If a woman is more, she's college educated, typically she's going to file for divorce 90% of the time. So the only place where a woman actually leads in initiating anything in a relationship is to end it. Now these numbers are very sobering and it's very sad. It's sad for both sides. This should not happen. I'm of the belief that I'm more on the romantic side. I don't think the relationship should be just pragmatic. But this is very sad, and it's especially sad for men and young men because they hear over and over again in society how they're not romantic, how they're not loving, and how they're not caring. And yet they're breaking their back and really putting themselves out there emotionally time and time again to move into a relationship. And typically it's the woman who just backs off and ends it. So we have to take a look at this and be honest, because there's a reason why we say that men live lives of quiet desperation. There's a reason for this. Unless there's a bunch of men talking at a club by themselves, they're not even allowed to express this kind of stuff. Here's something interesting about Valentine's Day. Something that could be considered to be romantic is, let's say, lingerie, for example. So let's say a man buys woman lingerie. She can feel good because she's the object here, right? Like she's made to look pretty, she feels alluring, she feels sexy, she feels all this stuff. So the man makes her feel good by buying her lingerie and making her the adored one. On the other hand, if she buys herself lingerie, she can also make herself feel good because she's the adored one. That makes sense to most people because it's obvious, it happens all the time. Let's think about Valentine's Day for a second. What if a man says, you know, it makes me feel very strong, powerful, and sexual when I wear a suit and tie. So for this Valentine's Day, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go out and buy myself a nice suit. A woman happy with that? No, because he's selfish. He bought a suit for himself. And this is part of what I'm talking about. Like, it's romantic to buy clothes for a woman to make her feel sexual, but it's not reversed the other way. It kind of doesn't make sense. Let's take a look at it like this. What if a woman says before Valentine's Day and says to her man, Valentine's Day is extremely important to me. It's a very important day. And the man says to her, that's great, I understand that. I can't wait to see what you have planned. That's not going to work, right? Because the expectation is that the man is supposed to figure everything out because he's supposed to be adoring her. The adoration of somebody else is the romantic part. It's romancing somebody. So by definition, men have to be more romantic. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't work the other way and it can't work the other way, but by percentages, it just makes sense that we're looking at this in a way that's not equal. Let's look at the other side of this, being pragmatic. What does that mean? It means dealing with things in a very practical manner. Stone cold decisions. Robotic. 2 + 2 = 4. That's my decision. So when we look at that, women in general, again, not always, but they tend to choose men that are a notch below them in terms of attractiveness. Why do they do this? It's funny, because, and I see this a lot as a personal trainer over the years. A lot of these rich women come in and they have guys paying their bill most of the time, but things have changed over the years, right? Like, women are getting more and more independent, so it's changing. But we'll talk about that in a second. Women tend to choose men for life partners. I'm not talking about a one-night stand or some just playing around with some guy for a while. I'm talking about a lifelong partner. They want someone who's not that attractive because they don't want that guy to have opportunities with other women. They don't want to have the attention being taken away from her. They don't want it to trigger her insecurities because when he looks good, it means that other girls are looking at him. And so she doesn't like that. So again, she's not choosing somebody she's actually attracted to. She's choosing somebody to just to be there and to hopefully that nobody else steals him. Why? Because although she's going after someone who's a notch below her in terms of attractiveness, she wants to choose someone who's a notch above her in terms of income level. And so that would be, not always again, but that would be a typical scenario that I see on a regular basis, and it's also backed up in the studies, is that a woman typically wants a man to make more money, to be able to satisfy whatever she wants in her life in terms of money and provisions. So the perfect guy would be someone who has a big bank account, but you can't necessarily see it. You can't see the bank account because when you look at him, he's ugly and overweight. And so the chances of, unless he's famous, the chances of some girl hitting on him is pretty low. Now, it's possible if he has a nice car, he's showing some of the money. But what I've seen over the years, women want guys that are basically going to be soft and let them get away with whatever they need to be as easy as they want. So if they could, in other words, if they have wants and needs, a guy will satisfy that by immediately paying for his stuff. And they're ugly, so they're not going to have a lot of competition. There's not going to be a lot of girls knocking on his door. So that's the first part of it. When we look at romance in general, again, can we say that romance was invented? It's really difficult to say because we're talking about an emotional thing here. But in a way we can, because romance was weaponized a long time ago. Why was it weaponized? Because poor men needed a way to romance women, to be able to be with women. Why? Because the rich, the emperors, the kings had access to all the women. And a poor guy had no chance to get a woman. So what would he do? He would do everything possible to try to move her heart and soul in a direction, to try to trick her in a way to making her feel a certain way, to make sure that she was loved and adored and appreciated, and that she walked on water, this kind of thing, and say the right things and do the right things to woo her, if you want to use that word. It's the only way that poor people, poor men, could compete with rich men. The interesting thing here is that it did work. So we're talking about chivalry. Now, part of being chivalrous was to not consummate the relationship, which I find really interesting. The reason for this is because they kind of justified it by saying, well, we're not going to consummate the relationship because that would end the game. We need to be romantic. We need to romance the woman, but not necessarily be in a relationship with her. What they were doing here is they were accepting the inevitable. Because although women who were with the king, were with rich men, were more than willing to have emotional affairs with them, because they were with men they didn't care about, they weren't in love with, they more than were willing to be with these guys that would adore them, say the right things, do the right things. But these men knew that the relationship wouldn't go any further, because no matter how much time they spent with that woman, no matter what they did with her, no matter what they said to her, they knew that she would never leave the king. They knew that she would never leave a rich nobleman. It wouldn't happen. So there were certain sayings that they used. Here is one. Marriage is no real excuse for not loving. In other words, we're never going to be married, we're never going to be together, but it's not an excuse for us not to love each other and act like we care. Here's another one. When made public, love rarely endures. Well, that's not true. But they say it like that because they know they'll never get the woman. They know that the woman would always put pragmatics ahead. They will always say, well, this guy can afford better food, he can afford a better house, a castle, whatever they had back then. And so they use that as their mantra, is that can't make this relationship public, we can't actually consummate this because it'll end the relationship. No, they were just trying to understand the inevitable and trying to accept it for what it was. So to sum that part up, women were more than willing to have emotional affairs. But in the end, they didn't go where their heart was. They went with who was paying for their food, who was paying for their castle, and by today's standards, who's keeping the lights on in the house. This is interesting too to me because as a personal trainer, I know the show's getting long, but it's all right. I've been a personal trainer for most of my life. I could tell you when I was a very young guy, let's say in my 20s and even my 30s, a lot of the women that would come in would have much, much more money than me. And that's because they were in relationships or married to men who had a lot of money. The people who could afford personal trainers back then were basically very well-to-do. And time again, I would get women over the years, because I've been doing it in this business for like 40 years now. I have hundreds, if not thousands, of older women that had money that over time would tell me things like, I'm too emotionally invested in you. I look forward to the training sessions too much. I love this time because I want to be seen and heard. This is the only time I feel cared about. Whatever, go down the list of that. And when you do that to a young man, it's really difficult because they feel like they're being loved. They feel like there's a chance to have a relationship with people that love them. And in fact, what's happening here is the same thing that would happen with the chivalrous knights in the 12th century France, is that the woman was dying to be loved inside, but she was still sticking with where the money was. And so they would walk around with huge holes in their heart and souls, and they would get attracted to a trainer that was treating them well, that was being nice to them, that was caring about them, that was fulfilling certain needs, not those needs, but other needs, emotional needs. And so they were all about it. But in the end, They'll always go with the money, almost always. And again, I don't I don't want that to sound bitter, but I also want young men who are listening to this too to understand that don't get carried away with your romantic side. You have to see this pragmatically, not because I would want you to be more pragmatic, because I think that takes the beautiful part of life out of it, but understand the people who you're dealing with. If the people you're dealing with are pragmatic, you have to understand you can't change them. So you have to understand where that is. Again, is every girl pragmatic? No, but by percentage, men put passion and love and sex and connection above who can pay the bills. It's just a fact, and I could say this through whether I'm a therapist, whether I look up all the evidence on this as a therapist, or as my 40 years as a personal trainer. I think that's about all I have to say about this today. Let me do a quick rundown of this. When we're talking about love and romance, I think that that's where really things should lead. I think it's unfortunate that I think it seems like most relationships are not that way. And if it's going to be that way, if it's going to be pragmatic, if it's going to be questions like, you know, did you put me on your house? Am I on all your accounts? Do you have a life insurance policy out on you? This type of thing, you know, what's in your account? You know, and in order to move a relationship forward. I don't think that that's what we wanted when we saw our kids very young, or if you don't have kids and you're looking at very young children, I would think or hope that you would want them to find love in the world and not somebody to just be a roommate with who's sharing expenses. I don't think that's a good way to go through life, although who cares about my opinion? It's everybody should be out there to have their own opinion, but I think if you're going to live for something in this world, I think love would be it. And again, that's why I think Valentine's Day is a very, I have mixed emotions about it because I don't see a lot of love out there. I see a lot of pragmatists, let's call it. So hopefully that gave you some things to think about. My name is Joe Peroni. This is the Rise Above Project. Please subscribe and tell a friend. Thank you.